Welcome. Disobedient Survivors challenge and change discourse around male violence, rape culture and sexism, platforming the stories, experiences and ideas that are often left out of these conversations. We explore the complex, messy and difficult. My name's Megan. I'm one of the co-founders of Sleep.
And I'm Bryony, one of the other co-founders of Sleek.
And today we'll be talking with Nicole Rose from Solidarity Apothecary about how state violence is a form of male violence, how they both intersect, and the significance of true solidarity, resistance, and care in the fight for prison abolition.
So could you explain a bit about your work, background, and the landscape or framework from which you're speaking from? And also, because we're going to be discussing the relationship between state violence and male violence, maybe you could explain what you mean when you use the term state violence?
Sure. So I'm Nicole. I use she, her pronouns. Yeah, I'm quite a long-term kind of anarchist organizer, got active like very young, and then experienced quite a lot of repression and went to prison, got a 3.5-year sentence when I was 21. And yeah, my first boyfriend got sent down when I was 16. And so I'm 36 now. So I've had a good 20 years of like navigating the prison system and organizing a lot of prisoner support in different collectives and just kind of like with my friends inside and partners and yeah, and also with comrades. So my kind of whole life, really adult life, has been shaped by the prison system. And with that, I've kind of seen the consequences of state violence in terms of losing friends inside, in terms of being witness to like vast amounts of violence, in terms of like the context of the prison system, which I'll talk about in a bit. And that kind of led me to a lot of like intense chronic health issues and PTSD and burnout and stuff. And from that, I, as a lot of us do, got into tried to find some sort of practice that would support me to keep organizing and keep going. And I found like herbalism, actually when I was in prison. So yeah, for the last 15 years, I've been studying herbalism, and then did like a kind of 4-year clinical training so that I could practice more safely. And I started a project called the Solidarity Apothecary, which is kind of focused on supporting people explicitly who are experiencing state violence, whether that's people, for example, in Calais, who are living in terms of like this border regime, border violence context, or former prisoners, people experiencing state repression. And I do like one-to-one support, and I do care packages, and I've published a few books that kind of centered on those themes. And yeah, that's kind of like the short intro to my work. But yeah, in terms of like what is state violence, like obviously it's like a massive question, and I've just published a book about herbalism and state violence and the role of herbal solidarity in responding to state violence. But I guess I always like to think, I always ask people what they think it is. And when we think of the state, you know, some people might think of, you know, like a town hall, or, you know, like a kind of croaking town hall with like old radiators and, you know, local councillors and stuff, kind of not really doing much harm, you know, it's center of democracy, all of this shit. But actually, when we think of the state, I think of kind of the most organized form of violence we have. And it's pretty clear throughout history that state development has kind of always come from patriarchy and always come from men. And there have been, and there are communities that live in stateless societies even now, and indigenous lifeways who haven't developed into like a state formation where there is like, you know, explicit hierarchy, there's a monopoly on violence. You know, the kind of power relationship is very like pervasive. And one anarchist that I quote in the book, Eric Larson, like he writes how the state is like an operating system. It's like Windows or Apple, like it's this kind of insidious way that our society functions. And it's not just like grey buildings or prisons or the police, it's also like how we think about our lives and how we think about power and who has access to resources. So we have this kind of like hard power or like covert violence, which, you know, people like, you know, we've all bounced around Bristol. There was obviously this huge riot in Bristol and massive amounts of police violence. Like that's one iteration of state violence. And then you might have something like the prison system, or you might have the border police and, you know, pushing people back on boats and stuff like this. But you also have these kind of like softer, subtle forms of like coercion, really, and kind of, you know, like believing that the state is the only way we can organize society. So we may as well vote for Jeremy Corbyn because we don't have any other like potential radical possibilities or whatever. So yeah, so I like to think of like things being quite invisibilized, like poverty, for example, is a form of state violence. It's the state working with capitalists, with the capitalist system, to create systems of like chronic oppression for people. And yeah, it's kind of invisibilized, but like rapidly shapes people's lives like all over the world. And yeah, with this kind of monopoly on violence can come down the hierarchy, right? Like the state can put people in prison, the state can bomb other countries, they can make children orphans, but if we fight back, then, you know, we're the ones put in prison. And so yeah, it's kind of about like hierarchy and how our society is organized. Is that okay as an introduction to the state? I mean, it's like a massive thing, right? But
Yeah, like that, I mean, yeah, it was amazing. And I mean, there's so much to be said about it. The point you just then, I think you started about how, I guess, everyone's relationship to what the state is will look different. And maybe also it's a thing that a lot of us might never have even engaged with, the idea of the state. It's like you were saying, we just have been existing in these structures for such a long time that, and part of living in those structures is to eradicate that way of thinking about questioning what you're living under and what you're being oppressed under, and what others are being oppressed under, that we're almost conditioned not to see and not to like view and not to challenge. So if you don't know what the state is, then you're definitely not going to necessarily engage with what state violence might look like for you or for others. So yeah, I hadn't really thought about that in that way. So thank you. And you know, we've already kind of gotten into it, but you know, you do talk a lot in your work about the impact of state violence. In what ways do you think state violence upholds and intersects with male violence, particularly in the prison system? In what ways have you seen this show up in your own experience of prison? And why do you think we don't acknowledge this form of harm as male violence?
yeah, it is the million-dollar question, isn't it, of how things intersect. And I guess, like I mentioned, like I think the state is like the ultimate expression of patriarchy in terms of organized male violence and structure and kind of systems of oppression. And I know like there have been struggles to have, for example, like more women represented in parliament and all of this shit, but like we can all know that it is male dominated, and you know, states around the world have like formed out of patriarchal societies. But yeah, in terms of prison, I guess like a bit of a content warning, like I like to talk about prison explicitly without like greenwashing it or making it, sanitizing it, and it is obviously like a horrific place. But my experiences inside, I volunteered as a listener with the Samaritans for 18 months as part of the kind of 2 years that I was in, and it gave me a lot of kind of intimate access to people disclosing their sort of life stories and seeking emotional support, and kind of, you know, really talking to people that were regularly like attempting suicide or self-harming. And it was really clear to me that nearly everyone I engaged with like had a history of violence like in their childhood, whether that was like very explicit sexual abuse or other forms of neglect. You know, tons of people had come from situations of like male violence, like domestic violence, like in their childhood or adulthood. And you know, there's lots of research and statistics around it, but in my experience, it was like I didn't meet anyone who didn't come from that kind of background, if that makes sense. And yeah, that level of trauma was like so intersecting with, like I've said, other forms of state violence, but things like poverty, of most people being in there not having access to resources to leave violent relationships, or have independent housing or have independent finances or anything like this. So yeah, it was really clear. You know, obviously there's a lot of like precarious like sex workers as well, and people in active addiction and kind of all the things, the melting pot in prison. But yeah, the kind of common denominator in most people's disclosure was being harmed by men, if I'm honest, like being harmed by rape and trauma and coercive control and different forms of domination, like interpersonally. And then maybe they didn't have the language to explain the state or poverty, but it was really clear that that was also like a driving force. And I'd like to say that this, I know I was in a women's prison, but like this is in men's prisons too, right? And obviously there's a lot of gender diversity in all the prisons, and they've made it super binary. But yeah, most men going to prison are also like survivors of violence, like especially in childhood, and also like in the sense of like being socialized in kind of very toxic masculinity, and being socialized to kind of, if they're like marginalized from capitalism, then they're often involved in some other form of organized male violence, like, you know, gangs and things like this, or different organized crime, which is not the state, but I kind of see them as connected because they're hierarchies of mostly men that use force and domination to control behavior and access resources. So yeah, lots of men going to prison are kind of involved in those systems as well, and are harmed by them, but also obviously are kind of co-creating them. Yeah, so it kind of was really clear that this like flow of people coming into the prison system were people who had like unmet needs from society, from violence they had experienced, with like completely inadequate responses to what they've been through. And then what's kind of like horrific about prison is like you've got a bunch of people who, like the Daily Mail, you know, the Daily Mail is like, oh, let's lock up the pedophiles, blah, 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 blah. But they don't think actually most people in prison have been harmed by someone who abuses children, right? So it's like screws with people's black and white thinking that people who do cause harm, you know, and shitloads of people in prison have caused loads of harm, but they're also like have experienced a lot of harm. So yeah, it's definitely not black and white. And I think that's what abolition tries to complicate for people, is that, you know, it isn't simple. Like it's not easy. Like people are traumatized, people, you know, further traumatize others. Like it's, you know, complicated. But yeah, in terms of prison itself, there's obviously like really large like incidences of like male violence from, excuse me, I've got hiccups, it's like the baby coming. Yeah, like there's really large incidences of violence. So like, you know, every hour the bell is like going off, and then like 12 officers are running in one direction, and they're going to like jump on someone and bend them up and drag them to segregation, and probably get in quite a few like kicks to the head and whatever else they do. So you have this like constant threat of violence from officers. And like, you know, when I went into prison, it was kind of like bouncing from like, you know, my mum's abusive boyfriends and those contexts, to then like living with other abusive people, to then, oh look, I'm in prison and it's like the same shit. It's just this guy's wearing a uniform, but he's bullying, controlling, sexualizing me, objectifying me, frightening me, like physically dominating me. Like it's all kind of like a continuum. And then obviously there is like sexual violence in prison. Like, you know, I did support people who had been like raped by prison officers, or had kind of consensual, got air quotes here for people listening, consensual relationships with officers, whereby they were giving verbal consent. But I kind of think if someone's got the keys, it's not consent. Like it's not an even power balance, like entering that relationship. So yeah, people were kind of ghosted out of prison who become pregnant, for example, by officers. I think after I left, I was in a place called H&P Bronzefield. I think like 6 different officers got sacked for like sexual assault. But again, they're not like criminalized, but they're like just, they've lost their job, right? Even though they've harmed all these people. And again, it's not just something that happens like in women's prisons. Like my friend was telling me the other day about Wormwood Scrubs prison in London, and like from 1992 to 2001, like 160 officers were like found out for like basically being in like an organized crew where they would like rape like people who just entered the prison, who were in segregation, and like not just rape but also like physical torture and beatings. And it was kind of like one of the biggest prison scandals, but just like hardly even made the news. Like no one really knows about it. Like if I bring it up, in a workshop or something, like no one really like, you know, kind of has heard of it in their cultural memory. And that's what happens in prison, is like everything is like completely invisibilized because it is behind walls. And then kind of society thinks of prisoners as like scum who like deserve it and all of this stuff. So advocating for people who've experienced harm in prison is really difficult. And the other thing I wanted to say about male violence in prison is that like you can't talk about like patriarchy or domination or even like equality or consent in that kind of environment, like because it's being perpetuated all the time. So I had a partner when I was 17, a different partner who got sent down for a year, and like, yeah, prison really changed him, like really traumatized him and kind of made him like much more like abusive. And he was in an environment where men were talking about, oh, we're gonna like smash it, and like which girl they're gonna like rape when they get out. And like, you know, he was kind of surrounded by this like worldview and this language that, you know, also infiltrated him and then traumatized him so that he couldn't regulate his emotions and had his own power and control issues, which really affected me. And yeah, it's just kind of part of this cycle of like putting someone in there who's like, you know, experienced harm or perpetrated harm. They're just gonna kind of get more fucked up and more traumatized in prison. They're not gonna be, you know, like this Christian kind of, oh, I've reflected on myself and I'm an improved person. It's pretty much always going to go in the other direction of like, you're even more traumatized and more likely to cause harm, and then have like next to no support or resources when you get out and be subject to even more state violence and poverty and stuff. And then just, yeah, the whole system just continues. And I'm sure there's like a million other intersections, but that's kind of where I got to with my little mind map of like, how does this relate to that?
No, thank you. Yeah, I think it's something that we often talk about, particularly the way that I think people need to see this kind of binary way of harm, of like people have either experienced harm or they've like perpetrated harm, and there's no in between. I think people are so naive to almost like anything to do with prison. One, because I guess like it's made that way deliberately so that people don't know what's going on inside, but also because I think people don't want to know often, or aren't interested, or aren't making the effort to like learn about or understand these systems. But I think most people that aren't doing any work related to prisons wouldn't think of what you were saying, that there's so many people, and most of the people in there, I'd say, as you were saying, like all the people in there have experienced harm and have experienced violence. I think people still see it as the people that have ended up in prison have perpetrated harm and just kind of see it in that way. And I think, yeah, it's so important that we start like sharing that with people, and people start to understand the complexities of the fact that everyone that's harmed has obviously been harmed. So that's where it starts from. Yeah, we've been involved in a lot of work around survivors' experiences of sexual violence and male violence in all different organisations and platforms and projects. And we found that in many of these spaces, survivors who are incarcerated or have been in prison are excluded from these conversations and this work. And I was wondering, why do you think that might be?
Yeah, I think it's almost like, why are people like excluded in general? Because I think the exclusion like permeates like all things, right? Of yeah, and I think it's because people in prison are like fundamentally like dehumanized. Like obviously people are already kind of criminalized, which creates like this kind of discourse in the media of you being evil and manipulative and all this shit. But I think the kind of dehumanizing effect is more kind of insidious, of like someone being kind of less than human or talked about like scum, or, you know, like there's often this thing, because our whole culture is like based on punishment, that like you're really like deserving of rape and abuse or coercive control. So it's like, you know, don't do the crime if you can't do the time. You know, it's like this analysis of like, you deserve to be punished if you've broken the law. Like, what did you expect? And you know, I can't remember who said it, but there's like that nice quote about like, you know, the law criminalizes like the rich and the poor in terms of who steals the bread. So it's like there's no context to it again of why someone might have to break the law. And like, yeah, just this kind of thing that like people in prison, there's just like this free pass on abuse of like, oh, don't drop the soap, you know, like these like rape jokes of you kind of deserve to be raped. And I also think, again, like you said, like people don't know what happens in prison, and like kind of the prison system or the criminal justice system in general is so naturalized and normalized and deemed as like necessary to like a functioning society. And unless you've kind of like found some random Angela Davis book in the library, like you're very unlikely to question that as a foundation of society. So I kind of don't blame people that that's where they are, because you don't think about it, right? You don't question it. And I think the difficulty with organizations that support survivors is like, well, for one, I want to acknowledge that like it is brutal, like being on the end of a helpline and hearing people harmed every day by men, or the police not responding, and people being like actually deeply unsafe, where you're like, yeah, this person might get killed, like they could literally get killed tonight and there's no infrastructure to support them. So like I do feel like empathy and compassion for people like working in that kind of field or movement, if that makes sense, because I think when you are kind of like directly or sort of vicariously exposed to that level of violence, like it's very difficult to hold compassion for someone who might be causing that harm, right? Like it's, yeah, like I remember in the pandemic there was like a mutual aid fund, and someone coming out of prison requested support from it, and someone in the group kind of like blocked it because they were like, well, we don't know what he's in for, like he could have been in for rape, or you know. So, and that person like worked for like some women's group, and you know, and I could understand that she was like struggling so much with her job and not getting enough support and listening to all these people being like abused and dominated and physically hurt. And but it was like interesting that A, she didn't know like what this guy had been in for, but B, like he's also just walked out of an environment of coercive control. And I looked up the kind of legislation around like coercive control, and yeah, like if it's okay for me to just read it quickly, like legally, coercive control is defined as a pattern of behavior which seeks to undermine a person's self-esteem or sense of self and restrict or remove their liberty or freedom. It describes a variety of controlling acts, including manipulation, intimidation, sexual coercion, gaslighting, a form of psychological abuse in which a victim is manipulated into doubting their own memory and sanity. And it's like everything in prison is about eroding someone's autonomy and self-esteem through intimidation, threats, humiliation, and obviously the deprivation of liberty, right, is like the main part of prison. So it's kind of interesting that this guy coming out isn't talked about as a survivor of coercive control or violence. And I think, yeah, like the challenges, like people like only socially know the criminal justice system as a way of kind of organizing like alleged sort of safety for people. And you know, most people involved in this world know that a lot of people who go through the courts and stuff, it is deeply unsettling and doesn't meet their needs emotionally. But you know, for some people, having someone who's really harmed them, who's tried to kill them in prison, actually might make them feel a lot safer. They might be able to walk around. And I think it's worth naming that and not disregarding that, because that's like very real. But I do think as a society, we kind of only think in terms of punishment, and that creates a problem because we're not addressing like the root causes of things like patriarchy or male violence or rape culture, or which is, you know, why your work's like really important and amazing. So yeah, so I kind of, yeah, I can see why people are excluded from these spaces because of this dehumanization of prison and people believing people deserve to be punished and they deserve to be put in cages. But I can also see the kind of not inadequacies, but like where we are as a movement in terms of abolition. Like, we do not have the infrastructure in place to really respond to harm on this scale in a way that gives people the confidence to be like, I'm not calling the police today because I've got someone else or another crew or a support group helping me. Does that make sense? So yeah, I never want to like judge anyone's decision based on their own safety or anything like that, but I just want to name that, yeah, prisoners are generally survivors of violence, like male violence, and experience it in prison even if they haven't experienced it before, and that abolition as a framework is trying to create alternatives to the state in responding to harm like this.
Yeah, thank you. I had like there's a question outside of the questions that we're asking that's like I'm trying to formulate in my brain, but like listening to you speak then about the kind of exclusion that a lot of people that have been incarcerated or been in prison experience on the outside when we're talking about experiences of like male violence or sexual violence. I was thinking about how in the work that we do, kind of how we started was very much about challenging these stereotypes and narratives that we have around like the idea of a victim or a survivor of sexual violence, and how even as within myself occupying the privilege in which I do, which is I pretty much fit the archetype of what is allowed to be a survivor, and even within that the kind of pressure to assimilate to this like narrative of being this perfect survivor, this perfect victim. And if you don't meet this criteria, then you aren't given the same respect or solidarity or care or protection or safety. And I was wondering, I don't know what the question is, but like it almost feels like that, and then you put that in the context of being incarcerated or in a prison where, like you said, we operate in a punishment environment. So any minute you commit, quote unquote, a crime, you're absolved from having any sort of rights or having any form of protection or respect. And so that intersecting then with being a survivor of sexual violence inside a prison, kind of coming outside of that, and you're not meeting, not only are you not meeting this narrative, if we were just to take it in the context of being women, so you're not meeting this perfect ideal of a woman, which she would never step out of line, they would never do anything that goes against this state, goes against patriarchy, goes against male violence, but you have your own experience of that. I don't know what the question is, but it's like, can you speak to how, I guess, the absolute like erosion of any privilege you would have stepping outside of prison, still with all your experiences of sexual trauma or male violence, and not being afforded the same care or respect as someone who hasn't been incarcerated but has a very similar experience of sexual violence, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think like yeah, one of my favorite books about prison or like abolition stuff is called like Unruly Women by Carleen Faith, and it's like really interesting about how there's this kind of like double down effect on women of like A, being criminalized, but B, also you've like ruptured femininity by, you know, kicking off if someone's tried to put their hands on you or stealing or doing something, like, you know, talking back somehow. Like, you know, I did meet a lot of women in prison who were there for defending themselves against men, you know, and obviously the kind of patriarchal court system had you know, minimized their role of self-defense, and so they had this like double criminalization of, you know, like you've like, yeah, like I shared a cell with someone who had stabbed her husband, and she liked to tell me the story every single day, every single evening. I was like, oh god, please stop telling me the story. But yeah, you know, like this guy had like basically kept a prisoner at home for like several years, and she was just like a fucking sex slave pretty much. And then like one day, I can't remember, he said something to her and she just stabbed him in the kitchen, and he survived. She called an ambulance and he came out. But yeah, but like nothing, no part of her history was like given context of why in this like one moment of rage have you defended yourself against this person who's harmed you for years and years and years. But yeah, sorry, that's probably not answering your question, but I think that those kind of narratives like follow people when they get out of kind of like, yeah, like like people really love, like especially like liberalism like loves individual responsibility, right? Of like, you've got yourself into this mess, so like, it's your responsibility to sort it out. And so yeah, when you get out of prison, you're expected to find work, even though most people don't want to give you a job, or find housing, even though you're probably on the bottom of the list because you're just got out of prison, like rather than a different context. Someone doing like a sliding scale offering isn't going to recognize your experience of oppression the same way they would a different kind of oppression. So yeah, it's all like a big kind of shit show. But I think it does come back to this kind of deserving, undeserving thing, right? Of literally like Victorian values of like the undeserving poor, like, oh, your layabouts or whatever, or like, whereas other people have a good work ethic and they should be rewarded for that. And I think it's just, yeah, if you're a trauma survivor, then like, you're pretty much either criminalized or you're pathologized as, oh, you've got a personality disorder or something, because your body has like expressed distress in response to rape or sexual violence or other forms of violence or trauma. So, you're likely to get, violence in terms of psychiatric imprisonment, which I haven't even mentioned yet. But yeah, I think it's wild how much of this stuff just comes back to these like insidious societal values of who deserves care and who doesn't. And, we see that even as a continuum with like rape survivors, right? Of, if it's like some random guy in an alley, oh, the horror, that person deserves support. But if it's someone who's been in a relationship with someone for 10 years and it happens to them, or someone who wears a short skirt at a nightclub, or is drunk, like it's just the same shit of who deserves kind of harm, and like who, yeah, like you said, like fits this like perfect identity of like deserving empathy and care from people.
I think you touched on something really important there as well, in that, like, yeah, who deserves safety and protection, and also who people think deserve punishment and who actually ends up in prison. You're speaking about, like, we know like the conviction rates for rape are really low, or we know that like, rich white men can get away with harming, murdering, raping women and individuals, and just completely get away with it. Whereas the people that you're speaking about, there's like people that have experienced male violence, and they're the ones that have ended up in prison for then retaliating with violence to protect themselves for their safety. And that in itself, I think, is a really good example of like how the prison system upholds male violence, in that we're allowing male violence to exist in our society. And then when people are protecting themselves or resisting violence, state violence or male violence, they're actually punished for that and ending up in these systems.
Yeah, and like if I can add, like it is that thing of like the Tony Blairs of the world, right, can be, like perpetrate like so much harm, like like invading Iraq and all these like soldiers that have like raped people, or we see it with the IDF in Palestine of like sexual violence being like so weaponized. Like I met loads of refugees from Ukraine who'd been like forced to watch people in their family get raped, like just absolute like unimaginable horror. But the kind of like impunity is there, and the responsibility is like placed on that one soldier, if at all. There's like normally no consequences. Whereas like I think I really don't want to ever justify or minimize harm in any way, but like for example, like someone that's like an easy conviction for the police, maybe someone's like hit his partner, which is like horrific, and I'm not condoning it at all, but like for example, that person might be having like an acute trauma response where they are in fight or flight, like near enough continuously, it's all they've ever known, they had the shit kicked into them as a kid frequently, and then they're having an argument with their partner, they escalate and it happens and it's awful, and then that person is like, there's such a low-hanging fruit for the police to convict, right? Like it's very easy for them to convince a jury that this person is like a monster and out of control, and yeah, like there isn't that kind of complexity of like, you know, what has that guy experienced through his life? And, you know, we talk about patriarchy and stuff, but I think men like also really experience the horrors of patriarchy, right, in terms of like sexual violence from other men and physical violence, threats of violence. Like it's, yeah, it's all there in this melting pot. And, you know, you can't talk about it without talking about like race and class, right? Like how many more people would get convicted of rape, for example, if they were Black or they were a person of color. Likewise, like if you're like a working class person or on certain medication or pathologized with some sort of like mental illness label, then yeah, you're much more likely to get a conviction. Even though now there is like an interesting trend of cops like criminalizing like older men who've like got histories of like kind of like vast organized like child abuse. So it's like interesting that like there's like an aging population in prison now, because it's become kind of like another way that the police can like justify why they're like useful in society. Like, oh look, so they're not interested in like catching that guy while he's like at it, or believing those kids when they report it, but 20 years later, when he's probably actually not a threat to anyone because he can like barely move because he's disabled, he's then incarcerated. And it just like rewards the system of like, look, like we need some court cases that appeal to kind of society's morals to kind of justify the whole thing, right? Like, oh, this was effective. Like, you know, what was the cop who murdered Sarah Everard? It's like, I can't think of anyone that gives a shit that he's in prison, you know? Like, I certainly don't do. Like, if I can die for all I care. But it's like that thing of like, they're trying to show that the system is working by securing convictions. And it's like a bit of a kind of magician sleight of hand of like, oh look, this system works, but like let's ignore all these like thousands of other people experiencing violence who don't have the care and support they need. Yeah
absolutely. And it's like in that, it's almost like the intersection then with like capitalism, because obviously like something we haven't mentioned that actually a lot of people don't know is how much profit the state makes from prisons and individual prisoners. And then if you've got like suddenly these older white men who, like you said, might not actually pose much of a threat. Like there was someone recently who's just like been arrested after like 29 years in Thailand, and he's come back, and you know he was going to be convicted of like child sex abuse, but now he's in his 80s. But it, you know, that was in the mainstream media because it's like, look at us, we're upholding this quote unquote safety of our citizens, bearing in mind it's only the citizens that abide by laws that we've created. And that's where like male violence, it almost intersects then with capitalism and sustaining this operation of making profit off of people and not actually doing anything around actual rehabilitation and care and support. And it can still feel like in the work that we do a contentious subject to talk about the idea of providing care and compassion and patience and love even and connection to people that have caused harm, because it still seems in many ways that you're an apologist or that you're condoning or not condoning sexual violence and male violence. So yeah, it feels like it's such a minefield to navigate, but also some really clear things that a lot of us aren't engaging with for many different reasons. You know, and we've talked a lot about violence and harm, which is very heavy. But we wanted to ask, sort of under these systems of violence that we're talking about, what acts of resistance, disobedience, solidarity, or collective care and liberation have kept you going, and kept you and other survivors safe? And either that's your own acts, so inside of prison or under oppressive power structures, or ones that you've witnessed that have given you like a bit of hope or power.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, my friend Kelsey, who I used to organize with very intensely in a crew called Empty Cages Collective, we were trying to kind of build a like abolitionist movement for several years before I like went to hospital and hit a massive like burnout wall. But her crew, Cradle Community, they've written a really interesting book called Brick by Brick: How to Build a World Without Prisons. And it's, you know, like UK focused, but they look at different examples of kind of building a society where prisons are unnecessary. So what does that look like in terms of supporting people experiencing like sexual violence, for example? What does that look like in terms of housing? What does that look like in terms of people meeting their economic needs, or, you know, even access to food, things like this? And it brings together all these beautiful examples of kind of like that other big thread of abolition, which is like creating the world that we want. So yeah, I would really encourage people to check that out. I think in terms of like personal experiences, like, yeah, it's definitely been interesting, kind of like the differences, for example, between like myself and my mum in terms of like me being involved in anarchist movements and grassroots groups and having quite a strong social network, that if I experience harm, for example, like a sexual assault situation, generally like I've been able to like access what I need from those around me, you know, like having a bunch of like badass, amazing feminists that are just like, you know, coming to take care of me or validate me or look after me in different ways, and vice versa, you know, showing up for each other's births, or you know, just kind of like organizing little kind of peer groups to support someone if they're suicidal, for example. So like I've seen so many beautiful iterations where it's like really gorgeous examples of care beyond the state that don't really like make a dent in terms of like building a social movement or all of this shit, but actually they're like they are these like webs of care and solidarity that are kind of invisible but like functioning. And I think it can be very frustrating being a kind of anarchist and like seeing the role of like resistance and how necessary it is in like stopping things, for example, resisting new prisons from being built, or resisting, you know, developments in Calais in terms of more fencing or more policing or building new detention centers. Like, you know, there's so much like necessary pushback that is, yeah, essential all the time. But I think maybe because of my life experiences and stuff, like I think, and this abolition influence, like I do like the more kind of informal, self-organized like networks of care that, but again, like those networks do kind of privilege people within them, right? And actually what was really clear in my childhood is if an individual doesn't have friends like or access to care, then they are dependent on other structures, you know, whether that's a women's shelter or some sort of like faceless charity, or, you know, and that's the kind of like where the real, I think, vulnerability comes in. And actually it's interesting in prison because a lot of people, I don't want to say they like being in prison because they definitely don't, but it's like where they suddenly access solidarity, like where you're not alone on the street, like, you know, giving blowjobs for 10 quid so that you can score. You're actually like in a fucking wing with like 50 other women who are there to like, you know, come and listen to you when you're upset, when you've had an argument on the phone, or, you know, like braid your hair for you or whatever. And I think like there was like a weird loneliness when I got out of prison of like, oh, I've actually, even though like prison is a hellhole, there's also like some weird opportunity for collective life that you don't get on the out. Does that make sense? Like it's, yeah, it takes a long time to build relationships of like care and support and friendships. And obviously the problem with prison is it like destroys all of those. So social networks that you have before prison are like very like fractured from being incarcerated. So yeah, so I think like those things, and then just kind of like, yeah, like I guess I kind of think a lot of like the queer world like can be quite beautiful in terms of like I remember when the invasion of Ukraine started, and it was like just this like effort to get all the like trans women housed, and get the queers out, and there was like already these like existing relationships of people kind of all over Europe and Germany and Poland who could just like safely house people. And it wasn't like, oh, we don't need this like massive NGO to make this happen, like we have these relationships. So that was really beautiful. But yeah, like I think obviously all of that stuff does need to be complemented with, you know, organized resistance and organized movements that can build power and challenge like structures and, you know, challenge genocide and put pressure on people with power and stuff like that. But yeah, it's, yeah, I think, I don't know, yeah, like with the Solidarity Apothecary, for example, like we have I work with a project called the Mobile Herbal Clinic in Calais, and we go to France like once a month for a week, and we provide like first aid and kind of acute health support to refugees living in the region. And like that's just like completely like DIY, self-organized, grassroots funded. Like medicine is made from a network of grassroots growers, and you know, we have doctors on the team, and we're very like professional clinically, but in terms of like infrastructure, it's like super grassroots. And I think, yeah, it is that like cheesy thing of like we meet our own needs, but I really think that's, the longer you're involved in stuff, that's really the case, right? Is like it is up to us to organize these structures and collectives and systems to meet people's needs, because like the state aren't going to do it, and big hierarchical organizations are not going to do it effectively either. So as we saw in the pandemic, like at the beginning of the pandemic, because obviously it's still happening, like it was like grassroots mutual aid networks that sprung up to meet community needs. And yeah, I wish they were more long term and like, you know, more organized in lots of ways. But I think, yeah, is the kind of nature of how things roll these days, is, you know, emergence and then kind of fallow times, so to speak. Yeah, sorry, I feel like that was a big ramble, but yeah.
No, thank you so much. Is there anything that you'd like to share in terms of like anything that you'd want people to know about your work, or how people could maybe support what you're doing? And yeah, get involved and like get a copy of a book or any work they can do in support of what we've been talking about.
Sure. So I've just published this book about herbalism and state violence. But I've just finished kind of selling the hard copies of it. But I am going to get it online as like an ebook, and it does introduce like various forms of state violence, whether that's the military or the border regime or police or prisons. Excuse me. So that's quite a good introduction to the kind of state violence stuff. And then yeah, like people, if anyone has any kind of clinical training, like nurses, doctors, herbalists, things like that, who would be interested in volunteering in Calais, like they really need folks on the ground. I'm actually about to have a baby in a couple of weeks, so I've sort of stepped back from doing lots of like distribution of medicine and supporting people one-to-one. But when I come back in sort of September, October, like I am available, like I have a sliding scale and I support lots of people for free. So if there's anyone listening who is, for example, a former prisoner or has a partner in prison or a prisoner family member who, yeah, is experiencing kind of like poverty or economic marginalization, which means they can't access support, then I would like happily support them the best they can. Like I think everyone deserves access to like high quality healthcare. And yeah, I try and focus on people who have experienced trauma and distress and the kind of manifestations of that in their bodies, like short and long term. And I teach a course about herbalism, PTSD and traumatic stress, which is going live again in October. And it's like completely like no one turned away for lack of funds. So there's like 60 lessons in there about the nervous system and different kind of nervous system states, and then how plants can support people to feel differently and to overcome kind of chronic illness. So yeah, like it is 100% free to anyone who needs it, but it will be available in October. And my website is just like solidarityapothecary.org. And also if anyone is supporting someone in prison at the moment who would like a free copy of The Prisoner's Herbal, this is a book I wrote based on my experiences in prison of like kind of 10 intimate plant profiles and then like instructions of how to make medicine in like a low resource environment. So that goes out free to prisoners like all over the world, and some folks are going to be doing that while I'm in babyland, so please keep requesting copies. Check.
Thank you so much.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, and forgot to say, I have a podcast called the Frontline Herbalism Podcast, where I will be publishing your interview soon. And there's different interviews with organizers and people involved in herbalism, but also things around trauma, like trauma and chronic illness, trauma and addiction. Yeah, all the things, so people can check that out on all their favorite podcast players. Check.
Thank you so much for today. It's been really amazing to speak about this, and yeah, really appreciate as well you coming and speaking whilst you're pregnant. It is an honor to have you.